Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Lot, all of these names that we see in Old Testament history were real people. Abraham lived longer than most. He was 75 years old. Now, to be honest, we have to have a guess about that because they weren't really sure about how they counted years. Didn't have calendars, that kind of thing. But in round numbers, or maybe literally, he was 75 years old. And he is in a place of pretty much retirement because he has a big clan. He has a brother that was real close to him. They both had families. Those families had children. They also had helpers and slaves and concubines and all of those kind of things that they had before things got a little more spelled out about what being faithful was. And at the age of 75, God shows up and talks to Abraham. Genesis 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse. And in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now these verses are the first expression of what is called the covenant that God makes with Abram. God makes another covenant when he's 80. They're extended. These are different expressions in different times. But the interesting thing about that is that God makes these great big broad general sorts of promises and doesn't spell anything out about what Abraham's actually going to get. They're ever-changing choices, and yet they stay the same. Abram, I make a promise to you, and I will be here. So how do we get from the concept of a covenant to a doctrine of predestination? If you have friends, probably not now because we Presbyterians don't talk about the word as much, but you probably, if you have someone who isn't a Presbyterian and you tell them, well, what do you think Presbyterians believe? One of the things that's going to come up is what? Oh, they believe in predestination. So I thought we ought to talk about it. But before we do, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Wrong answers start from the wrong questions. You can't arrive at a good answer if you start with the wrong question. So what does predestination mean? Well, a lot of different things related to a lot of things, and most of them come from the wrong questions. Question number 1. Who gets into heaven and who doesn't? That was actually a question in the New Testament churches. It's part of the reason that Paul writes the lesson that we'll hear later. But you see, we're all worried about whether or not we're going to go to heaven. They were worried too. And so we start asking that questions, and theologians take up the question and get all complicated about it. And by the time of Origen, which is in the 2nd century, Origen winds up saying that God had decided before creation who would be going to heaven and who would be going to hell. It didn't take long, did it? And the reason was that Christians were dying before Jesus came back. And Origen was trying to give the Christians comfort. They didn't need to worry. They were Christians. They would go to heaven. Now, it was great comfort to the Christians, especially persecution and those kind of things. But who was it not any comfort to? Huh? The people who weren't Christians. The people who weren't Christians. Inside the shop, we didn't have to think about that. But people inevitably are going to ask the different questions. So, who gets God's grace and who doesn't, if that's predestination? The elect. The elect of God. Do you know where that comes from? Who's talked about the elect of God? I can't hear you, the wind. Who talked about the elect of God? John Calvin. Have you ever heard that word? I mean, you ever heard about John Calvin? Well, guess what? Calvin was not the first one. In fact, most everything Calvin said was not the first thing. Did you know that Calvin was a Catholic Church lawyer? Did you know that? That he interpreted the law as a Catholic. And his Reformation started not to start some great big different church, but to try to correct things that were misappropriations of early Catholic law. And he did lots of reasoning. So when it came to predestination, he went back to very good reasoners about predestination, namely St. Augustine and St. Aquinas. And a lot of what he wrote was taken from that. And this whole thing about a comfort to the souls of the elect in predestination was right there in the Institutes, the 2-volume thing that I was forced to read one time. And I wasn't even a Presbyterian then. So there's a fallacy in the question and in the answer. And the fallacy is that if you take the answer, you get to believe, well, I'm in. I'm going to heaven. And if you disagree with me, well, you know where you're going. Right? One of the troubling things in the history of the church, in all of our history, is we have gotten into times and seasons when we have said, we're right and you're wrong, and there's something wrong with you. How many of you have heard that before? Okay. Yeah, one of the times is called the Crusades. So what's the real question? What's the better question? Well, love is not about deciding for someone else. Great marriages are not built when one partner tells the other partner what to do all the time, or what they're going to do all the time. Great relationships of love don't happen when one side has already made all the details. How could God ever have already decided who was going to hell and who wasn't? Would God even be interested in that question? Because the problem is, the real question is God loving or is God not? You have to decide that. And once you've decided it, a lot of bad questions go away. Bad question number 2 about predestination. Is God in control? Right? God decides what will happen to us and everything that will happen to us before we are born. It's one of the themes of the doctrine of predestination in history. Calvin gets real close to that. Everything is predetermined by God from before and after. So if that's true, we can't even joke about how God predestined that we would be here, and some of the church members would not be here, because God determines everything. So what's wrong with that? Well, this shows up in Calvin because Newton and the birth of science said there were fixed divine laws of nature. Remember that? Fixed divine laws of nature. Everything is locked down. And we have to live with the fixed laws of nature. Right? You want to test the fixed laws of nature, jump off a cliff and see. I mean, that, you know. One time I got to talk to a really fascinating new mathematical physicist who later became an ordained clergyman, wrote some books. Faith of a Physicist was one of them. And he said, you know, it's really interesting, in the quantum world, things are not fixed. Not even the path of electrons in an atom are fixed. They're constantly changing. The world is constantly changing. The law of nature is not fixed, it's changing all the time. Now, he knew what he was talking about because his name was John Polkinghorne. He was on the team that discovered quarks in England. And he later became Sir John Polkinghorne, one of only 2 ordained people in history to become a Knight of the British Empire. Really smart guy, way too smart for me. But he could spell it out for me in ways I could understand, unlike some preachers, even me. So what's the real question? If creating is an ever-changing adventure and change is real, God is not in control, because it's wide open. There's no micromanaging, no chessboard. What's wrong when we say God is in control? God gets blamed for the bad stuff and the good stuff. What's happening this week in the newspaper is God's fault. You want to blame God for that? I don't think so. So you have to be really careful about using that phrase. A Presbyterian minister of Hollywood Presbyterian, the day after 9/11, was interviewed by public television. He had been chaplain of the Senate. That's why they got the interview, I guess. And they asked him, what do we do with all of this happening? And he said, we do not understand these things, but there is one thing we know: God is in control. And I will not tell you the theological word that I used when I heard that on national radio. God. So if creating is an ever-changing adventure in our lives, the better question is, what are we going to do with constant changes in our lives, in the lives of others, in the world? Bad question number 3. Do we really have free will? If everything's predestined, do we really have free will? Well, artful thinking comes back with the, well, yes, we have free will. Of course we have free will. But God already knows what we will choose. I have heard this out of the mouths of Presbyterians. That's the most absurd comment you can imagine. It is going around 3 bushes in rationalization. If God already knows what you're doing, what's the difference between that and being determined? Because you don't have the chance for novelty and choice. And we all know we do, don't we? In fact, that reason for that prayer of confession is we all know that our sin is not God's fault. Choices and changes are real, and they shape our lives. So the real question is, where are we headed, and how do we get there? Isn't that the question? How do we get there? It's about choosing. Now, I had a little bit of work in the process of making moral decisions and changes and stuff, and one of my professors said, you have to be careful about talking about ends and means. Some questions and ethical theories are based on the ends. What is the good end in mind? Others are the means. Well, the means are most important because they determine the ends. Have you ever heard that kind of theory? Well, how many times do the means actually determine the end? No, there are all kinds of intervening variables that we don't have any control of. So you're in a quandary that way. And if you choose the end, guess what happens? If you choose with the end in mind, you wind up in the middle of a holy war. Because whatever the end is, it justifies whatever means you think you have to take. Do I need to illustrate that this week? Okay, I think you're all still with me here. So, is God loving or not? Well, I think the broad history is that God's loving even when God can't control what happens to God's own Son. What are we going to do with all these constant changes? What else can we do but live in the middle of them? And in the middle of that, where are we headed and how do we get there? That's the real question, isn't it? That's the question in our lives. There's no get out of jail free card. There's no God will do it for me card or God has already done it for me card. It comes down to commitment. And that's what Paul is really talking about when he's talking to this church that wonders where they're going. You have to remember that Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was the fair-haired pick of the Sanhedrin, who were the ruling body of Judaism in the first century. And they believed in predestination as they were the elect of God and the other people were out. So Paul believed that he was in, and if you didn't agree with him, you were out. So Paul thought Jesus was out. He chased him around. You remember? He held the coat for the soldiers. And then this thing happened on a Damascus road. Now, I know we're all really sophisticated, but remember that the world is not fixed nature, and the world may have some really interesting surprises for us if we're humble and admit all of the things we don't know, instead of that if we don't know it, it can't be true. There's some miracles in the Bible that are pretty easy to explain, actually. And as my great friend, Old Testament professor, said one time, they're just some miracles you have to take straight. Paul has this lightning bright vision on a road to Damascus because he's chasing Christians. They're the enemy. And he hears a voice, and here's the kicker. He recognized the voice. Do you remember that? He recognized the voice. And the voice said, "Paul, why are you persecuting me?" Just for fun, I looked up the word persecution. The third definition of persecution in the American Dictionary says, to pursue in a matter to injure, grieve, or afflict, to beset with cruelty or malignancy, to harass, especially to afflict, harass, punish, or put to death for adherence to a particular religious creed or mode of worship. Why are you persecuting me? And out of that, Paul comes to this. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God, who are called according to God's purpose. For those whom God foreknew, God also predestined to be conformed to the image of God's Son, in order that the Lord might be the firstborn within a large family. So Paul uses that word, doesn't he? But not to mean that everything's decided, and not to mean that some are in or out, and not to mean that even if you did have free choice, God would know what you were thinking before you chose it. What Paul is saying is that God in God's love has set things up so that if you are willing and you work at it, the goal is that you would become more like Jesus. Until ultimately, the great gift is you get to be like him. It's not about predicting where you will wind up. It's telling the people who follow to quit worrying about that and start worrying about what they're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to become committed. Focusing on life changes is what brings change. So the questions are, how does my life show progress in becoming more like Jesus in my decisions? How am I forming myself into his likeness? I had a friend who did this, a guy named Ed Walthall. Did any of you ever know Ed? I know you did. He was an amazing, wonderful man. He was my predecessor in one of the jobs I took here in San Antonio. His favorite phrase was, when it comes down to a decision between doing what is loving and doing what is right, doing the loving thing is always right. This Christian life is just that simple. But the problem is that it is unbelievably difficult to decide in complex and confusing situations, much less when others or even our own evil gets mixed up in decisions. So the good question, the really good question, is always, what is the loving thing for me to do? And we get help with the question. We have this model who helps us if we're committed to the way. And the last night he was at that table with the followers, he told them that the great law, love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself, was too hard to understand and left too many open questions. And it would be much easier for them if they just loved others the way that he loved them. Heaven is God's business, and it's way beyond our knowledge realm. And the world of suffering proves how not loving works out. So the difference that we can make is being a witness to loving neighbor and even loving enemies, which is exactly what he told us to do. Jesus told us we just have to be faithful. And if we are, at least we're giving love a chance. We need to keep trying to keep the warring sides who think that they are the ones who get in from murdering the innocents left to care for each other. We need to help the innocents and give them the hint of where we ought to be in control in our situations. We can exercise control in our lives. We can exercise control in some things that happen. In fact, we can just be loving and just let the results take care of themselves. Amen. Let us pray.